Welcome to the UX Coach Podcast Season 2, where we're expanding our exploration into careers in digital design and user research to look into the challenges of getting into the industry and making good progress. In this episode, I'm really happy to be in conversation with Caroline Jarrett. Caroline has been an important voice in digital design for many years. Her mantra, "Fix the Forms," is what lies behind her timeless book, Forms at Work, Designing Web Forms for Usability, and her forthcoming book on survey design, which I'm sure will become a go-to for years to come. I wanted to hear about Caroline's diverse career, her thoughts on design leadership, management and career progression, as well as the state of education and what challenges lie ahead for people coming into digital design in 2020. This was a really deep dive, and so this episode is a little longer than usual, but I hope that you agree with me in that it was well worth it. Let's get started then. So Caroline, thank you very much for joining us today on the UX Coach podcast. It's really wonderful to have you here. I thought what would be a great starting point for this is if you could tell everybody a little bit about yourself. Let's start with the immediate. So what are you doing at the moment?
Well, at this exact second, I'm thinking, isn't it an absolute treat to have a chance to chat to Andy and being given the opportunity to come onto his podcast? But I mean, you're probably looking at more than this current 5 minutes. So at the moment, I'm having a little bit of a sabbatical. I'm having 3 months from October through to December to really give my long overdue book on how to design surveys, which is called Surveys That Work, to have a real push on that and actually get it finished and out and handed over to my extremely patient publisher, who will be astonished to actually get something from me. Possibly I ought to just let them know that before this podcast comes out. So that'll be on my to-do list for this afternoon. And, you know, I really can't thank Lou Rosenfeld and my editor, Marta Justak, enough because I don't know if you know, but I was ridiculously ill in 2017 and still quite ill last year. And their support was absolutely unbelievable. So I am hoping that they will actually accept this manuscript from me. So that's my immediate focus. And I'm also very lucky that I've got the help of two great friends who also work with me. So Jane Matthews is a life coach who's also helped me with various training and writing things. And recently I've had the very exciting thing happen, which is another very good friend named Tara Land. Tara was my boss as head of user research at Government Digital Service, and she's now working with me part-time. So all in all, I'm feeling in a really good place about that long overdue book.
I certainly would like to hear about some of the projects you've been working on this year, because we've ended up sort of inadvertently crossing paths on a couple of things. And I know you've been providing some advisory guidance to a few different groups. You've been doing a little bit with the NHS earlier this year. Is that right?
Yeah, I've had a really exciting project with NHS Digital. So I started doing some work with NHS Digital really about a year ago. I did a couple of odd days before that, but I actually wasn't really well enough. And I just have been doing some days here and there as I've kind of got better. My work has been aligned with the NHS Digital Service Manual. So initially it was about turning up, and they showed me this thing that was in alpha, and our meetings consisted of me saying, "Ship it now," and them arguing with me. But they did ship it pretty soon, and the beta version has been very well received, primarily with content around accessibility and content, things like their content guidelines. So they have had an article that I wasn't involved in, which is really great, about why the NHS recommends using the words pee and poo rather than sort of excrement and urine, because those words are much more recognised by people who really need to recognise them. So at the moment, it's been mainly around accessibility and content design. My area is really how to make forms easy to use. And so I was doing quite a few expert design crits with various groups around NHS Digital, who had forms in their work for one reason or another. And it was obvious that there was a need for some guidance around forms. And in particular, when they released their new front-end library, one of the teams took a form that didn't use that front-end library, moved it to using the front-end library, but unfortunately the forms didn't test well with users. So nothing against the team. They worked hard to do the best as they could, but they literally had no guidance, and they didn't happen to have a designer on the team. So it wasn't no criticism of them. What we decided was that exposed that there was a lack of appropriate guidance in the manual about how to do better forms. So I did a bunch of work on creating what ended up calling a topic map to say these are topics that might go in. And then I did some more work with Sarah Wilcox, who's the content designer, to say that this topic means this thing, to get sources. And then I handed it over. And at the moment, the team, Sarah as content designer and Sarah Wilcox and David Hunter as designer, and then some new members of the team who I haven't quite managed to learn their names because they've joined after I've moved on. They're actually working on the right good questions section for the service manual, which I saw it the other day, and I was saying ship it now, this is great, particularly as they're very good at doing the right thing, which is making something into beta and then really iterating on it. They don't forget it, they keep on top of it. So that's been really exciting to see. I think it's going to be really good advice that people will actually be able to be interested in and use in their work.
I think it's been really great to watch so they've started to take quite a proactive approach, following in the footsteps of UK government digital services, to publish and broadcast when they do their sort of big all hands kind of show and tells, right? And there was one earlier in the summer which was about the launch of the front end toolkit for people that are working on these new platforms and improving online NHS services. And it was really great to just hear them talking in such like high spirits and being really excited about it, but also that they've taken a model, so that they've taken the concepts from the government digital services and the service manual and then gone, okay, so how do we fork this to make it more applicable to our very specific natures, which I think is a really interesting approach.
Yeah, it's been great. And as you said, it's not instead of the government digital service manual. It's about building on that, on the GDS manual, when health services are different. So, for example, the NHS front-end components include a component called 999 now, the emergency ambulance. That's not going to come up in government digital service. So that's an example of something where there's a real need for how do you handle that for healthcare, which government digital service are never going to get to.
Yeah, it's not really one of those things like with Verify and Pay, which have been the two sort of really big projects over the last years, where it's creating something that could be used by lots of different people. It's very distinct to the context of why people are there, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Let's kind of do a bit of a potted history, because you've been involved in so many different things and some really, really interesting projects. And I'm kind of curious to know how you explain to somebody what your role is and what you do, because I would say 20 years ago, probably have been a designer or some kind of information architect. There's all of these terms that have come out since sort of like 99 that are basically saying the same thing but different. And a couple of years ago, I might have said, "Oh, yeah, so Caroline's an amazing UX designer who's a specialist on accessibility and forms." But I don't think that that's how you would describe yourself.
I really love that you're referring to that, and also that you refer to 1999, which is like the halfway point in my career. So I am old, right? I mean, I don't feel old when I go and see my parents, who, thank goodness, are still with us, but I do feel old in most of our work because I'm very much on the upper age range of people that I work with. I'm actually taking a new direction. So in the new year, my current plan is to focus on two things. One is I'm really aiming to do a lot more training. So I'm hoping to put together more training courses and more open training courses in usability, user experience, design, the stuff that I do, that I'm kind of known for. But the other direction I'm going in is that I've started to call myself an artificial intelligence feasibility investigator. It's like, what is that? Because I've noticed that at the moment it seems to be much easier to get funding for things that have artificial intelligence in them. And it's always been incredibly difficult to get anybody to pay for making forms easy to fill in, which is what I've specialised in for 25 years. The costs of forms are enormous. I've always longed to persuade anybody to give me 0.01% of the cost savings as my fee, but I've never been able to persuade anyone to do that. But generally, I can save huge amounts of costs, but I haven't been able to get that message out to people, or they don't want to hear, or they don't believe me. They want to do digital transformation. I don't care. I mean, I do care that they want to do digital transformation, but it's somehow fix the forms one at a time, which is one of my little mantras. Just doesn't seem to be exciting enough for people to want to pay me to do that. So I thought, okay, artificial intelligence, what do I know about it? And I thought, blimey, I actually know a lot about it. You know, like my very, very first job way back as a student before going to university was as a data editor on the gamma ray satellite COS-B. That's not like Cosby the comedian, it's COS-B. And that gamma ray satellite collected millions of spark chamber events, only a small proportion of which were actually interesting gamma ray observations. So they had this massive computer system that filtered out ones that were potentially decent events. And they had about a dozen editors, mainly students like me, I believe. And we looked at the potential events on screen and decided we could accept it or reject it or edit it so that they only got proper events. So I was like this little human cog in this artificial intelligence system that was doing gamma ray observations. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's pretty cool, actually, isn't it? And I thought, well, I actually got into forms because of artificial intelligence. That's how I ended up in forms, because I ended up working on a project for Rank Xerox, which was a build and operate project for the European Patent Office, where the European Patent Office wanted two suppliers to scan the patents and publish them digitally. So it's a digital transformation project. And we were using artificial intelligence in the form of optical character recognition to do character recognition on the patent income patents. And it kind of worked and it kind of didn't work. It's like all artificial intelligence. It kind of works and it kind of didn't work. And the interesting part for me is not how it works, because there's lots of people who are much better at programming than me who can make the AI thing work. The bit I'm interested in is making that IA thing produce a really good system in real life, in the real world. The feasibility of it. How do you make sure that when you take this fantastic bit of AI, you really get it to work? And so that's what I've been changing direction to do. What has artificial intelligence feasibility investigator got with compared to form specialist? Well, I'll tell you a deep dark secret is like the job titles keep changing, and it's the same job. It's looking at services, looking at processes in the real world and saying, if we want to do this intervention, what do we actually have to do to make that work with real people, real jobs, real computers? what computers can do, what people can do, how do we allocate the jobs across them? And that's what I've been doing for 25 years. And like last week, that was described as designer. Along the way, I've been a usability consultant, I've been a UX consultant, I've been a design thinker, I've been an IA for a bit. When I started, believe it or not, when I started my business in 1994, I described myself as a data capture consultant or business process re-engineering prototyper.
That is the best title I've heard so far. Maybe you should go back to that one. That's phenomenal. Wow.
Business process re-engineering, is the 1990s, 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s equivalent of digital transformation. It's the same job, it's the same thing, it's the same ideas. But if you say, oh, look, digital transformation, you mean business process re-engineering, then people look at you as if you're an old person, which of course is true.
See, I just find it incredible if what's the saying? It's something along the lines of, everything that is new is old and everything that is old is new. Because if you read back through all the way back to sort of the middle of the Second World War was when machine learning was first starting to be catalyzed as a space, and natural language processing. None of this stuff is new. It's almost 100 years old. It's purely just we've finally reached a point with processing power, right, where we have the ability to do it at speed and scale.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I love the internet. The mere fact that we're sitting here, I love all the modern tools. We were able to use 2 different meeting technologies within 30 seconds. We were able to set this up quite impromptu by using digital methods of communication. Things that used to be so hard in the olden days are much easier now. It's kind of new, and yet some of the ideas from the olden days are also relevant. I don't want people not to innovate, and I love it when new people come along with new ideas. And if they reinvent the ideas that I've had in the past, I work really, really hard on being excited about that. Because if they don't reinvent them, I mean, this is a thought from my mentor, Ginny Reddish, and her husband, Joe Reddish. They say, as you get older and in a design profession or any profession really, you've got 2 choices. Either the younger generations come along and reinvent your ideas, or the ideas die. That's it. You don't have another choice. So learn to celebrate it when people come along and have the same ideas. And then the other side of it is I don't have a monopoly of ideas whatsoever. I mean, I really, really don't. But another message I give out a lot is to say, I'm telling you about my old mistakes so that you can make fresh, new, different ones. That's all I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give you the space to make new, interesting mistakes, not mistakes I've made in the past and wasted my time on. And that does sound a bit patronizing, I suppose, but that's really what I feel.
That sounds to me like a good segue into questions on what does future talent look like. So you're saying about being really excited about what comes next, and new life being breathed into these industries, and artificial intelligence, big data. These spaces are very much at the forefront now. What do you think is going to happen next from the people that are leaving school this year, next year?
Wow, that's a really interesting thing. I mean, one of the things I really worry about for the 20-year-olds, let's say, is it's really tough on them these days. It's really tough to get started. When I was coming out of university, it just seems unbelievable now. But even though I came from a comfortably off family, I actually did get a grant, and my parents were in a position to supplement. I got a bit of a grant. My tuition was free, and my parents were financially able to support me with the remaining grant. So I was okay financially. I came out of university. Also, I was really fortunate that I got a couple of very good vacation jobs as a student. And we had the milk round. The milk round was the name for employers used to come round and have careers fairs where they tried to entice you to apply to them. Sometimes I worry a lot about, how can I be encouraging? But these wonderful young people now, they come out of university. Number one, they don't drink like we used to. They work really hard. They're bright as a button. Most of them, not all of them. It's important to remember that even a 20-year-old or 21-year-old can be digitally excluded, particularly if they happen to have a disability. Life is incredibly tough for those kids, even though they've done marvelously to get an education in the teeth of a very alienating system for people who are young with disabilities. And really, what are they faced with? They're faced with, in our field, they're faced with one or two really cool exceptions, like NHS Digital has a fabulous graduate trainee scheme. But mostly you see adverts that ask for 3 to 5 years experience. Like, get over yourselves. What's 3 years experience, frankly? From my point of view, you might just as well be a rank beginner. I mean, it doesn't make any difference to me. Like, I might start thinking you've got a bit of experience when you hit 15 years, but that's number one. Number two, every new project, you start with no experience, So why not hire someone who's genuinely new from time to time and learn on it together? I don't know how I've gone off in this riff, but I just feel that they've got the future in their hands. What I think is going to happen in the future is completely irrelevant. What I want to try and do in the future is create more opportunities and more encouragement for people who are just starting out into this field to really be welcomed in it, to feel included, to feel that their contributions really matter, to stay in it. I mean, the dropout, particularly from women, is appalling. It's a very alien environment for women. It's a very alien environment for people with disabilities. It's a very alien environment for people who come from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds. There's, Dean Vipon wrote a great blog post today, a real call to arms on Medium about how we've got to work much, much harder to create inclusive environments.
This age gap problem, like you say, of every single job is looking for 3 years experience. And it's like, well, where am I meant to have got it from? And I think I definitely suffered from that, mainly because I didn't have an education to lean on either. But we definitely have a problem with digital design, actually all technology. Somewhere along the line, we failed to put together that like apprenticeship model or whatever it needed to be in the way that big industries had before. I don't know how we redress that to correct that error. It seems like we've hit a point where it's like, oh, we're too far gone. I'm not sure what we can do, but maybe there is something. I mean, do you feel like you would have been in a position or moving forward where you could potentially take on an apprentice, for example?
It's a really good challenge, and I'm glad you threw it back to me. And it is something I have been thinking about, of getting an intern or an apprentice to work with me. And it's definitely something I'll consider in the future. My main problem has been I'm only a one-person organisation, and I still don't work that much. It sounds strange, but I'm still very part-time. I can't actually do that much work even now. And so it's like, what am I inviting them into? But then there's really no reason why I couldn't have someone as an apprentice or an intern who is equally part-time. Not everyone who's at the start of their careers or perhaps returning to a career after a break, which is kind of what I am, is in a position to work full-time anyway. So it's really a good challenge and something that you've encouraged me to think harder about. Yeah, thank you.
There's something in exploring a little bit more, as a community, this idea of sort of mentorship and coaching. You mentioned earlier you've got two great people that act as your mentors. I certainly have a group of people that I know that I can go and talk to and ask advice for. And then I try to do that as much as I can to other people as well. But it's very infrequent interactions. Maybe there's something that we can learn from that kind of model of being able to adapt this sort of apprenticeship model so that it's perhaps more of the you have the support when you need it, but ultimately it's for you to sort of strive out and make it on your own, which almost seems too intimidating. I've been talking to someone actually this week with user researchers. There's a big influx, particularly within digital services. Civil servant user research is through the roof in terms of the amount of it that's getting done, more so than I think I've ever seen in any industry. But they all want people with experience, because the teams that are being built don't have experience themselves, and they don't have experience of being able to nurture others. There's this big gap of parents, basically, is how I kind of look at it. There's a big gap of people who are willing to raise others. So it's always the cliched line of needs to be able to get up and running on their own and self-facilitating and everything else. And it's like, okay, well, what about the tens of thousands of people that are looking for that first opportunity? They can't do that.
All very good points. I'm seeing a bit of a bright light in there. And one of the reasons why I personally have decided to focus more on training going forward is because I see that people want to buy training, that they're thinking of ways in which they can get their more junior staff or their newer staff skilled up. And they're also thinking about ways in which they can bring that training in-house. So I'm discussing at the moment with one government department doing some train the trainers training, where they want to skill up their permanent civil servants who are more experienced user researchers to deliver training courses to more junior colleagues, or colleagues who might not be junior but are relatively new to user research. And these are for some of the more specialist topics, which, for example, the civil service learning just isn't really going to cover. Some of the more detailed things that we need to do as user researchers. That is one way I see of trying to help us invest in the future. Because, as you say, it's just been thrilling. I mean, I was doing a lot of user research on the tax return with the what's now HM Revenue and Customs, but in those days was the Inland Revenue, the self-assessment tax return. I did a load of usability work on that and the processes around self-assessment. And that time, there were like a dozen of us in the UK doing user research for government, and it was really lonely. When it worked, it was great, but it was hard and harsh. And now, there's at least 100 times that, I think. It's thrilling to see how much people are really investing in user research, but there is that lack of confidence really in teams, in organizations that are funding user research that are new to it. They're saying, oh well, we need people with experience, but there's only so many people with experience to go round. There's also like there's this plug in the middle problem where we need to find ways of getting younger people or returners or people who are newer to our profession into it and launched with confidence in the right direction. And we need to find ways of supporting people who want to become more senior and retain their technical roots. It's been very difficult in this country, outside of academia, to progress as a technician of some sort, as a senior technician. Sun Microsystems, the computer company, they had a program, I'm not sure if they still do, for being a distinguished engineer, where you could carry on doing engineering. You didn't have to become a manager in order to get promotion and stuff. I don't see a lot of that around either. So there's this problem of a bulge. We want everybody to be in the middle. We don't think about how to feed people in, and we don't think about how to move people on in their careers once they've hit that 35, 45, okay, what do I do now problem.
But that's really interesting to me, because this new language that has appeared, which is the concept of an IC, or the individual contributor. And I didn't really get what that meant until I started talking to people that were actually still working in like programming roles, where they were saying it was like, I am not comfortable being responsible for another human being and their success. I don't want to be a manager. I don't want to sit and look at budgets and things like that every day. I want to just keep focusing on how do I make that plate spin faster? How do I, learn this new language to see whether it's something that we can do and experiment with it? And I think that's where that sits. And to be mindful and acknowledge that some people do just want to do that. They want to be really great craftspeople, and we should embrace that and allow them to keep going that way. I wonder whether that is what resulted in ultimately you starting your own business and becoming a consultant, was that was the way that it would allow you to do that, was the alternative to follow a traditional career path, which would ultimately lead you into management and no longer fixing the forms.
My career path was completely different to that. What happened was I was a project manager. So I started work as a software engineer in 1980. And within a year, my natural aptitude for bossing people about had been spotted by the bosses. And I was running projects like within a year as a manager and partly as an engineer. And so at that point, I, from personal experience, became convinced that management was a separate specialism that you could do as a specialism from the start. I mean, frankly, I could do programming, but I'm not that good at it. But I'm quite good at I'm pretty good at the kind of all the soft skills you need around that stuff, like negotiating with the management about what it's realistic for your engineers to deliver. But I was doing it from a young age. So I learned very quickly that, a manager is just a job. It's not a more senior or more junior job. It's just a job. But this country, we're obsessed with the idea that managers are more senior. And why did I become a freelance? Well, at the time, I was working for a big computer systems integration company that built a lot of PCs and Unix boxes, and started doing work with the then Inland Revenue was because they were supplying all the PCs and Unix boxes to the revenue offices. So I sort of accidentally started working there because they wanted someone who understood about optical character recognition. One day, the managing director called us to an all hands, as they do. And the managing director, basically, there's two things I'll never forget from that talk. One was that he stood up in front of all of us and said, "We need to stick to the knitting. I'm not sure what that means." And I thought, seriously? Are you telling us to obey a mantra and you don't even know why or what you're talking about? And then he said to us, "You can be assured that you'll always have a job so long as you find the work to keep yourself employed." And I thought, I think that means, why don't you go and be a freelance? So I did. And then the third thing that happened around then, now I've done 13 years as a project manager. And when my friend said to me, "You'd have done less for murder," I realized that was kind of how I thought about it. As a project manager in those days, if it went well, that was because it was easy and you didn't get much credit for it. If it went badly, it was your fault, no matter what you'd tried to do. And so I got fed up with that. And then for a while, I was a project turnaround specialist. So I'd go into failing projects and sort them out. And that's fine, but it's an awful lot of shouting and sacking people. And I found that kind of distressing. And so I was really fed up with all of that. I'd been project managing the delivery of this optical character recognition system to the revenue for processing forms. And going back to my artificial intelligence feasibility investigation, it didn't work. But it didn't work differentially. So I had one system that was in Manchester that was processing one type of forms, and it really didn't work. I mean, it dramatically, uselessly didn't work. And I had another system in Cardiff that was processing a different type of forms, and it was fine. And clearly the difference wasn't the climate, it was about something to do with the type of forms we were trying to deal with. So I did a whole bunch of investigation, the sort of things I would now recommend people did as artificial intelligence feasibility investigation for any type of AI intervention. Did a whole bunch of investigation, and it was about the way the forms were filled in and who they were filled in by and what the system was for. And long story short, the punchline is that the forms in Cardiff were filled in by bank officials, and if the standard of completion was too bad, the revenue would just send the forms back and say, try again. They'd send 10,000 forms back to a bank and say, fill them all in again if it didn't reach a certain threshold. And the forms in Manchester were filled in wild stereotype, but mainly by elderly people who were claiming back £20 worth of interest, and they'd done the best they were ever going to do. We had to design the forms so that they could fill them in. We couldn't send them back and say, try again. It just was never going to happen. They'd done the best. And so that's when I became obsessed with how do we design forms that are easy to fill in.
So it's very much this just sort of natural progression. To an extent, I feel like it's a little bit of a shame that government digital services have started to solidify this concept of a user researcher, and there's such a grey area across these things. Like, what a missed opportunity if you have someone who's got that really fantastic inquisitive mind, are really good at being able to articulate what they've witnessed and communicate that and share with everybody, that if they have an idea of an approach which you might be able to explore, that's kind of like, that's lovely, but your role is to report the facts and that's it. Starting to break apart the UX design generalist is a bit of a shame. What kind of job roles do you see emerging in the future, particularly in this artificial intelligence space? Because there's a very different set of technical skills that are required, isn't there? Like you've got your data scientists and the engineering side of things.
Really good question. I'd like to just slightly backtrack to your point about GDS fragmenting user-centered design roles into various different jobs. I don't really think that's quite fair, in that we've got two things that we need to do here. There's two different problems that sort of overlap and intersect. One of the things that we undoubtedly need to do, let's just take user research, and we'll come on to data science in a second, so I'll loop back to your other question. If we just take user research, in order to deliver good digital products, you've got to do, or digital services, you've got to do user research. You're not going to do it if you don't do your user research and act on the findings. So you have to do the two things. You've got to find out about people and how they're using the thing and what they're doing, and then you've got to act on what you find. So you have to have those two things. And you rapidly learn that the things you need to do for digital are things you need to do in general. I mean, I've done loads of user research that's got nothing to do with digital. I've done loads of user research that overlaps and has a digital component. Saying that we have to do user research, one of the easiest ways for an organisation that's new to all of this, if you're an organisation that's relatively new to whatever we call the thing these days, I mean, I tend to call it user-centered design. Another common happy phrase these days is digital transformation. One of the easiest ways to get started on the disciplines that you need to ensure in your teams is to get people who do each of those disciplines and get them to work together. A way of getting started on user research is to get a user researcher. A way to get started on data science is to get a data scientist. Do you need to keep them all fragmented in the future? No, not necessarily, probably not. And it's relatively rare in practice to find a team that has every single role they really need represented in that team. Often they've got to share people, particularly data scientists, as rare beasts, and you normally have to share one amongst several teams. You may not have a front-end dev. You may have to outsource that. You may have a back-end dev who is then using something like a front-end library to try and get up to speed on the skills they need for the front-end side of it. So what tends to happen is once you've got over that initial hump, you start seeing more a pool of people who may have different skills. And you might have someone who is a user researcher, but is also really good with words, and they're happy crafting some of the content design. Or you might find you have a designer who's particularly enjoys the whole process of encountering users. So they might double up and do some of the user research. And so I think eventually the pool starts to blend a bit and we have less fragmentation. You asked about what jobs do I see coming forward in the future? And definitely one of the problems, basically in my heart, I'm a qual and I get all shivery when I think about a t-test, my statistics. We do need to think more about the numbers, to find ways of actually getting hard numbers, soft numbers, more numbers into our work, and really think about whether once we're starting to do stuff at scale, how many people are using the service, what problems they're having at scale. We may not have access to a data scientist. We may feel worried about statistics, but just looking at a few raw numbers is going to be an essential skill, I think.
I suppose it's part of the challenge with all digital technologies anyway. I do, from my experiences of teaching, there is a type of individual that comes into design, and it's often that it's someone, this creative spark, whatever we describe that as, and this ability to make things, and a lot of it is still about being able to work with your hands. They are not necessarily people who are comfortable with numeracy in any form, which is also why they're not doing engineering, because you spend a couple of weeks looking into what programming actually is and you realize that it's math. And I think I'm mindful perhaps that there's a risk of that if we keep driving towards things being more and more driven by data, and that the design discipline needs to start to encompass that more, that it might detract certain individuals from getting into it, because we'll start looking at things as being like, if you work in digital design, basically what you're doing is you're building these very complex chatbots or voice systems or facial recognition or whatever it is that comes next. It's more science driven than art, I suppose.
Gosh, there's a lot to unpick there, and I hear and sympathise with a lot of what you say. I think that we tend to put numeracy in a box and accept that some people don't feel comfortable with numeracy, and yet to some extent we all do feel fairly comfortable with numeracy, in that, for example, most of us know. Let me give you an example of something that most of us might have a clue about, how much we spend on our mobile phones every month. All right. Mm-hmm. Now, okay, that's a number. And if you know that number and you have a view about that number, you've got some numeracy skills. So it's like, I'm not comfortable with numbers. Well, you are. You're comfortable with some numbers. It's just that you haven't thought about the level of skill you really have, and how you can apply that level of skill to the numerical aspects of the problems you're working on as a designer. It's yes, some people do. I mean, I have mild dyscalculia myself, where numbers jump around like as if I've got dyslexia. I mean, I don't have it too badly, but it's there and it's always a bit of a worry. Some people have it worse than me, and they just simply can't grasp the numbers at all. And it would mean nothing to them to say, well, how much do you pay on your mobile phone bill? But people with that level of dyscalculia are really unusual, and they've developed other coping strategies. But, one of the things I try and explain to people is that the numbers you need are not that complicated. So, for example, as a designer, people say, well, we've got this, and this type of user. And you say, okay, how many? How many fall in that category, and that category? And how do you know where they fall in that category? Supposing you're a small business and you've got 500 customers, and someone comes along and says, I'm blind, I need help. You might do better to negotiate with that exact person for what they exactly need. How many? You should still design for access, because you never know whether you could have 1,000 customers and 500 of them have access needs and you haven't designed for them. But getting a flavour, just asking a few simple numbers like that can really help you as a designer to figure out how to remedy a problem, or where to put your efforts, or think about where to put your support needs. Those are the sort of numbers which are not that difficult, but it really does. The data scientist can help you, but you can look at a graph yourself and say, oh my goodness, we have a peak every Monday at 9:00. What's happening?
Is there sort of a dividing line of any kind then between analysis or an analyst and the role of like a UX designer or a service designer? Is it a skill that you need for the future when we're working in this big space, to be able to read into numbers at a different depth to that you've just described, which to me is sort of, it's looking at the high level numbers and the big numbers where it's really obvious?
Both. I think we need some people who are willing to get a grip and understand the statistical significance and all of that sort of thing. And I think the rest of us need to just make sure we're asking ourselves some basic questions about the symbol numbers. Is this about what would I put on the curriculum, or what I would suggest people actually do if they're not comfortable with those sort of numbers?
Yeah, I guess so, because I mean, we're still in 2019. There's not really strong education in standard higher further education for digital design in the way that it is practiced commercially. It's getting better. It's definitely a lot better than it was even 4 years ago, but it's still not great. We're still reliant on private organizations and private bodies creating, boot camp courses and things like that to be able to teach the methods and processes that we use on a day-to-day.
Yes, I agree. And if it's any consolation, I would say that is a unsolvable problem in higher education. That the academics, the academic advisors like you, who are practitioners who help with the academic decisions, are always on a catch-up. That we're always, certainly for all the time I've been around, and I'm sure it wasn't a new problem when I started out, people were complaining that the sort of things you got taught at university or in higher education courses or at school were not the things you actually needed in the workplace. And that's partly because it's always going to be that, because the workplace changes more quickly, and some of those changes, it's like in natural selection, there's lots and lots of changes going on in the workplace, and by evolution some of those changes will turn out to be a bit of a dead end. Like, virtual reality, I won't say it's a dead end, but it's not turned out to be as mainstream as we thought it might have been at one point. It's still there. It's still an interesting technology. Its days may come, but you and I are not implementing VR systems tomorrow, for our everyday clients. So there's this sort of, what's happening in real life is always much more messy and evolutionary, and the academics have got to try and look forward. They're trying to teach, they're designing a curriculum today that they're hoping to launch people into the marketplace in 3 years. What's going to be happening in 3 years? And then they're trying to equip people for the 5 years after that. So they're trying to look 8 years ahead, and meanwhile there's all this messy stuff going on in real life, and they're trying to work out, what do I need to teach people? What's in a secure enough state that I can teach people? What's exciting enough that the students want to study it? How do I merge all that together? And at the end of it, send someone out who's got a decent chance of a job before, within the next 3 years, and skills that will equip them for the first 2 or 3 years at work. We'll always see a need for doing the sort of work that you're doing, which is working with an academic curriculum as an assistant lecturer, or coming in and doing stuff that says, this is what I'm currently working on, and this might be something that will still be happening in 5 years' time when it might be useful to you. And also, what's the underpinnings of the field that people need to teach? So I think that was a long way of saying, yeah, it's a problem we just have, and we'll always have.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think maybe it just leans more when you start looking at it in that perspective, particularly that point on that you're trying to forecast of what is going to be usable in X number of years from this start date for this particular student. It just, to me, emphasizes the need for that apprenticeship model of the archetypal day release experience, where actually you're learning on the job, and the things that you're doing in the college is to demonstrate that you've been turning up and listening and doing the thing, making the thing.
Also, I want to wave a flag for traditional academic concepts like academic rigor and evaluation of evidence, and just having some time to think about some ideas intensively over a period of time is a good thing to do, even if they've got nothing to do with anything.
Okay, I think we've probably hit a point of running out of steam, and I know that you've got stuff to get on with for the rest of the day. Caroline, thank you so much for taking the time out today. It's been really great speaking to you.
It's been fun. Thanks very much.
There you have it, another episode in the can. I always enjoy speaking to Caroline. She's been a true voice of reason for me in the last year. And if this is your first time hearing about Caroline's work, just go and follow her on Twitter, CJ Forms, where you'll get daily enlightenment into what makes good design. I'll be back in a few weeks with another guest to talk about design and user research careers. And if you'd like to come and join us, get in touch at theuxcoach.com. I'll see you soon.